One of the things that biblical scholars and researchers know is that even if a text does not change in 500 years, it does not mean you are reading the same text in your head when you read it. Because the meaning of words actually change over time. A word can mean one thing in one decade or century, and mean something entirely different in another decade or century. So even though the words might not change in the text, the definitions of those words are changing. That is why retranslations of texts from original languages are periodically necessary over time. The definitions of words change. One example of how drastic that can happen is an out-of-print book, published originally in 1884, on comparative religious studies, by a Harvard Unitarian pastor by the name of James Freeman Clarke, entitled 10 Great Religions, published by the Houghton and Mifflin Publishing Company. On your screen is the title page to the book. If you look at the right panel, you will see the dedication page. On the dedication page, the book is dedicated to, quote, J. Peter Leslie and Susan I. Leslie, in memory of many hours of happy intercourse. This book is affectionately dedicated. End quote. This pastor would probably roll over in his grave if he knew what that dedication meant today. Because today, the word, intercourse, is defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary as, quote, physical sexual contact between individuals that involves the genitalia of at least one person. End quote. Now obviously, this Harvard graduate minister never intended to say that. In his day, the term intercourse only meant the same thing as personal dialogue. So this pastor was referring to his time of personal discussion with this couple. Counter-Reformation theology depends on this kind of confusion. The very same way the dedication page of James Freeman Clarke's book, 10 Great Religions, read. And they do precisely the very same kind of exploitation with those changes in words, as would any preacher today, reading the dedication page of that book. They exploit the meaning of two words in chapter 13. Those two words are, the words, earth, and, the word, world. In fact, they do more than exploit them, they actually depend on spreading ignorance and confusion around those two terms, to spread the theology. The term earth is used 81 times in the book of Revelation. It is used 5 times in chapter 13 alone. The term world is used 7 times in the book of Revelation and it is used 2 times in chapter 13 alone. So the terms earth and world are used 7 times in chapter 13. And as the number 7 indicate, they are a lamp in chapter 13. They reveal something important. But unfortunately, they are the very target of exploitation by the Counter-Reformation. Today if you ask someone, what does the word earth mean, you are going to see what the Google search page pulls up when you Google the question what is the earth. It is going to pull up a description and pictures of what we know today as the planet Earth. But that definition is as strange to biblical writers, as the modern definition of the word, intercourse, was to James Freeman Clarke in 1884. Biblical writers never used the equivalent of the modern word earth, because it did not exist until the 1400s. The same thing is true about the word, world. Today if you use the term world, it will invoke the very same common definition among people, you will find, when you Google that term. And it will pull up the fact, the modern term, world, actually uses the term earth in its definition. The modern use of the term world as opposed to earth, is that the modern term world includes the existence of societies and nations in it, whereas the term earth, primarily refers to the geology of the planet itself. And that is the only difference between earth and world. And as you will see, neither of these concepts are referenced in chapter 13 of Revelation by the English words, earth and world. In fact, those are gross distortions, counter-reformationists routinely perpetrate on purpose. Even though it is immensely deceptive, and is turning their audiences into victims of disinformation. There has been a tremendous amount of intentional disinformation concerning Revelation chapter 13. And while a lot of that disinformation has come from the way counter-reformationist preachers intentionally deceive their audiences, not all of it has come from the preachers. Some of it has come from the translators as well. Because there is a tremendous amount of information that has been hidden, either intentionally or unintentionally, by translator laziness or bias. There are amazing details in the text of this chapter that have been buried by translators, that will shock a modern reader, if they see the raw specifics of what exists in the underlying Textus Receptus Greek manuscript. In fact, those details will provide even more than specifics of his prophecy. They will provide, as the title of the book suggests, an actual revelation to modern Christians. But for many, it might not be a revelation they want to see. And thus, why so much effort and money has gone into actually hiding it. But the truth is, if it's not profound enough that many want to keep it hidden, it's probably not much of a revelation to begin with. The Wikipedia article explains, quote, Otto Edward Leopold, Prince of Bismarck, Duke of Lauenburg, known as Otto von Bismarck, was a conservative German statesman who masterminded the unification of Germany in 1871, and served as its first chancellor until 1890, in which capacity he dominated European affairs for 2 decades. End quote. Otto von Bismarck is quoted as having once remarked about European government, quote, "Don't believe anything until it has been officially denied." End quote. While it sounds funny today, there is actually a great deal of pragmatic truth to that comment, especially when it comes to the book of Revelation. John chose the term, revelation, on purpose, in chapter 1 verse 1, for his writing. You will often hear commentators and preachers explain to their audiences that the term means unveiling, like when a bride takes her veil off after a wedding and her face is revealed. But that's a very pretty, sanitized explanation of John's use of that term. Actually, it is first used in the Greek Septuagint, when Saul condemns his son Jonathan for siding with King David, and says he has brought shame to his mother by exposing her nakedness, which was an idiomatic cultural expression to describe shame of the worst possible kind. Because ancient dwellings were small and often rooms were only separated by curtains, it was an experience that would often happen when a son would accidentally walk into a room and see his mother's nakedness. Despite the fact the experience was a common one, it was always off the chart in terms of shock to everyone in the home. And thus its use as a euphemism for shame and humiliation that was shocking. In the Greek language, it is the first use of the same term used for the title of the book of Revelation. John is writing something that he says is going to expose your mother's nakedness, or in other words, shame of the worst possible kind. And that is precisely what Revelation chapter 13 actually does. And also, why so many work so hard to hide what is in it. In the next section of this series, we will examine the actual Greek text directly from the Textus Receptus, which is the underlying Greek text for most translations of the New Testament, including the King James Version. We will take a look at how it has been translated into English. And we will also look at what has been left out, and why. You are about to discover what the counter-reformation has been desperately attempting to hide about Revelation chapter 13 for over 500 years. And this may be the first time in your life you have ever been exposed to this material. If it is, you will find much of what you are about to see shocking to your very core as a Christian. But it is also what converted thousands of very dedicated and very sincere Catholic priests in Europe to return to the search for a true biblical faith for the first time in medieval Europe. And what changed the course of Western civilization, bringing about the religious and intellectual freedom that gave birth to modern science and modern Western democracies, along with the separation of church and state, providing all citizens with the protections of religious freedom and liberty. The book of Revelation itself served as a bad-tasting medicine that helped to heal all of Western civilization from the Dark Ages. And the truth of the historicist interpretation, once known commonly by virtually all Christians during the Reformation, will do the same for our societies today, once rediscovered by modern Christian audiences. All you have to do to change the whole world is simply change yourself. We begin our look at the Textus Receptus in verse 1. On the top section on your screen, you will see a word-for-word interlinear of the Greek text into the English word. Underneath that will be shown the King James translation. and then the last section on the bottom of the screen will be shown a literal retranslation of the Greek text. In each verse, we will show you the Greek words that have been mistranslated or hidden by the King James translation, as we go through the chapter. And in the bottom text in blue, we will show what the improved unfiltered literal translation, from the Greek text, should look like. While a few texts in English will reflect the Greek text almost identically, as you will soon see, in other places, a lot of linguistic detail has been either sanitized or lost in our English translation. First we will translate the first prophecy, which exists between verses 1 through 10. Then we will translate the second prophecy, which exists between verses 11 through 18. Beginning with the first prophecy in verse 1, the King James Version reads as follows. Quote, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy." End quote. This text is very accurate to the Greek text, and you do not see much difference between the KJV text and the Greek text here. There are 3 very minor notations to make in verse 1. The first is simply to note that some translations will have the dragon standing on the shore, rather than John. But that deviation is incorrect because in verse 2, John describes what he saw, and uses the first-person personal pronoun to refer to himself. So when you see some translators put the dragon on the shore, seeing himself rise out of the sea, you can know that is incorrect because if he was the one on the shore, he wouldn't be looking at himself and describing what he sees. The second notation to make is that both the Greek and English say standing on the sand of the sea. That is a rather long way of saying he was standing on the shoreline, or what we call today, the beach. The third notation to make in verse 1 is that the King James Version says on his heads is the, quote, name of blasphemy. End quote. In the Greek, it is simply the name blasphemy, as you can see in the interlinear at the top. Verse 2 in the King James Version reads as follows. Quote, "And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority." End quote. Verse 2 is similar to verse 1 in that it is also an accurate reflection of the Greek text. There is however one very important difference. The fourth word from the end of the text displays the word seat, and that is the Greek word thronos, which is literally where we get the English word throne from, and literally means throne. So we have made the correction. There is obviously a difference between a seat and a throne. And we will reflect that difference in the language, using the literal term throne. The King James Version was produced for the Church of England, and you will see whenever the Greek text begins to implicate monarchy in something, the translators will begin to play linguistic dodgeball with the text, like they did here, concerning the overt use of the term throne. The King of England is also the head of the Church of England, so you can see why they were motivated to hide the reference to throne in the Greek. You can see that we are only 2 verses into the chapter, and already, we are seeing the English translators hide things from the text. The example in verse 2 is the introduction into what comes next in verse 3. We are going to see a major obfuscation in the next text. Verse 3 reads as follows. Quote, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death. And his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." End quote. And now we come to the beginning of some major ecclesiastical censorship on the Greek text, and we are only 3 verses into the chapter. The counter-reformation perpetuates the cover story that the Antichrist, referred to as the beast, in this text is a superhuman political leader, who receives a deadly wound to the head, and then recovers. And that fiction is based on this KJV text in English. First, even in the rather distorted English text, you can see that John is speaking symbolically, not literally, because if it were literal, you would have to have a man with 7 heads. And only 1 head is wounded. Meaning his other 6 heads were fine. Biologically speaking, a human with 7 heads would be so massively deformed, they would not survive birth. There has never been a case of a 7-headed person, because even 2 heads in the case of Siamese twins, endangers their lives, and more often than not, requires surgical separation at some point, in order to save their lives. So, in the first place, they actually ignore the fact there are 7 heads, and secondly, They ignore the fact that only one head of 7 are wounded, and that is all even before we actually get to the Greek text. But when we get to the translation of the Greek text itself, we run into some amazing translation decisions. The first thing we note is the choice of the word, wounded. Wounded is actually not the definition of the Greek word, sphadzo, in the text there. The primary meaning of the Greek word, sphadzo, means butchered, or slaughtered. As in the phrase, as a lamb to the slaughter. As you will see as explained in Strong's Greek lexicon stating, quote, especially as in an animal for food or sacrifice. Meaning butchered to eat. So you see, there is quite a bit of difference between what is in the Greek here, and what is reflected in the English King James Version translation. The second instance of the English word, wound, occurs 6 words later. But again, here while the term, wound is a little closer to what is actually meant, it is still at best, only an implied meaning. The Greek word, phlegē, means to strike. It is actually from the Greek word, pleso, which literally means, to pound flat. It is a repeated striking action that results in something being flattened or pulverized. The English word wound, simply means to injure. These two words are not cognates to one another. So it gives a completely wrong impression of what John has written. And John adds the detail, just in case you didn't get the idea, that it was, quote, to death. It was butchered to death, and in the word that occurs 6 words later, translated as wound, it is the word strike, as in to pound flat or pulverize. John has created the picture of something very bloody. Something that has been beaten and butchered. Not simply wounded. But if you are perpetrating a fictional person who recovers from a wound to the head, that information doesn't support that false narrative, does it? And that brings us to the next odd choice of words in our English KJV translation. After the first English fiction, in the word wounded, and the second word wound, we read the third problematic English word, which is the word, healed. But if you look at the Greek lexicon, you will find that that is once again, not the primary meaning of the Greek word, therapuo. Healed is second to the last word in the list. It is only there at all, through an implication. The primary meaning of the Greek word, therapuo, is actually, to wait upon. As in worship. It is a particular kind of worship. Strong's defines this term as to wait upon menially, as in, to adore. It is from the Greek word, therapon, which means to be a menial attendant of, or a servant to. It is bad enough on its own, that heal is not even the primary meaning of the term. The fact that you do see, heal, as the second to the last word listed, as a tertiary definition only. A novice might fail to see, how poor this word choice, actually was, to translate this word. Because you at least see, it is listed in the definitions. But the problem is, it actually isn't. What the word, therapuo, means, when it is used as the word heal, has nothing to do with how it is used in this text. Because, when it is used to refer to the idea of healing, or being healed, even Strong's lexicon notes, it is specifically in the sense of the term, cure. As in, cured of a disease. Cured. Not just healed, but cured. You do not get cured of being butchered. You have to be resurrected to overcome that. There is no cure for being butchered. Cures occur when you are healed of a disease. The term, therapuo, only means healed, in the sense of being cured of a disease, and yet, the translators made the decision to choose the tertiary misapplied definition over the very clear primary definition of the term, and which makes complete sense. But the text begins to get a little too close to home, theologically, and thus embarrassing. And thus why the tertiary definition is used to actually replace the primary meaning of the word. To adore. To put it bluntly, John is describing something that has been butchered and beaten, and that this butchering and beating is actually worshipped and adored. So we will correct that to the word, adored. The fourth corruption of the Greek text occurs in the word, world. As we have mentioned already concerning the term world, that is not the Greek term here. The Greek term here is, gay, which means only land. The fifth problem comes with the term, wondered. If you look into the lexicon, you will see that wonder is listed as a primary meaning. But there is a problem with the lexicon here. Strong's lexicon was published in 1890. In current modern English, when we say wonder, we mean to be surprised or puzzled by something. As in the phrase, "I wonder what he or she meant by that." It is a word that has had its meaning change with the usage of time. In Strong's explanation of the term wonder, he also lists the terms admire and admiration. Actually, etymologically speaking, admire and wonder are originally the same words. Admire comes from a conjunction in Latin of two terms. The syllable ad, which means at, and the term mirare, which actually means to wonder. So admire and wonder are from the same terms. But while the definition of wonder has drifted, the definition of admire has not. So a better word to translate this term would be admire. Admire means to feel respect and approval for or be an object of esteem. This is much closer to what is in the Greek text. John is saying that this butchering and beating to death will be not only worshipped and adored, it will become the object of esteem, as in admired. We will correct that term wondered to admired. The last term in this translation we will correct is the term after. It is simply putting it into better English idiom. If you look up the Greek term, opposol, both after and behind are listed as the definitions. Behind is idiomatically more logical to modern English expression. So we will correct that to the word behind. And now we have a clean retranslation of the Textus Receptus Greek text for verse 3, and it reads as follows, quote, "And I saw one of his heads, as butchered to death, and the stroke of his death was adored and admired in all the land, behind the beast." End quote. As you can see, that is quite different than what the Church of England wanted people to read in their English translations. The text is actually beginning to get recognizable. And when we are finished with the translation, we will go back through in an exegetical fashion and look at what each of these verses mean. You will be quite amazed at what John has really written in this text. Now we come to verse 4. The King James Version reads as follows, quote, "And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" End quote. The term worship is being translated from the Greek word proskuneo. And once again, it is listed at the very end of the list, as the last definition. You will notice that many translations, such as the KJV, will often have the very last term listed in the list of definitions. And more often than not, it is the term listed by way of implication only. It is not even the definition of the term. When you see that too frequently, it tells you the translators are stretching the content of a text to get it to say something other than what it really means. The term means to kiss, like a dog licking his master's hand. To fawn or crouch to, that is, literally or figuratively prostrate oneself in homage. To do reverence to, or adore. In modern English, the term worship is very ambiguous, primarily because of its theological baggage. Most people do not believe you are supposed to worship anything but God. Therefore, they reason to themselves that whatever they do to someone else, even if it is kiss like a dog licking its master's hand, or pay homage to, or crouch to, as in a bow, or prostrate themselves in front of, they will not admit that as worship. So let's not use that word. Let's use the other word which is actually listed in the definition of this term, which is to crouch to. Because it actually fits the context of the verse better. When you read the English KJV text for verse 4, it looks like the people are bragging when they say, "Who is like the beast, who is able to make war with him." But that is actually not what John is saying here. John is saying that people crouch to the dragon and they crouch to the beast, and the excuse for that subservience is that no one can stand against the beast. Anyone who resists will be destroyed. They are crouching in fear. There is a modern English word that expresses the same idea, but reflects the tone of what John is writing better. That word is the word grovel. It actually means to crouch, but it reflects the negative sense that John is writing about here in verse 4. So we will use the word grovel in our retranslation of the text to reflect the fact in the text that people are crouching in subservience because of fear. Our retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "And they groveled to the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they groveled to the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to fight against him?" End quote. In verse 5, the KJV reads as follows. Quote, "And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And power was given unto him to continue 42 months. End quote. In verse 5, the phrase, "speaking great things," needs some attention. All three English words need some clarification. The Greek word, lealeo, translated speaking, is also the word translated preaching in the New Testament. There is a big difference between speaking, which is done by anyone, anywhere at any time, and the word, preaching, which is done by a clergy, or a religious leader. But since it is the same word in both cases, which one should be the correct word to use in a translation into English? Since the text is saying that he is given a mouth, which means he is given a platform to speak, as a formal official act, the correct word would be preach, not incidental occasional speaking. This verse is all about a continual official activity of speaking from an officially designated platform. So the term speaking, referring to the simple casual occasional statements of speech, is doing more to hide what has been written here than translate it. So we will correct that term to preach in our retranslation. The second term that needs attention is the term great. In modern English, if something is great, that means it is good or noble. But that is really not the sense of what John is saying here. The Greek word megas just means big. So we will correct that term back to the English word big. The word things is not in the Greek text at all. So our retranslated text from the Textus Receptus reads as follows. Quote, "And given to him was a mouth, preaching big and blasphemous. And authority was given to him to continue 42 months. End quote. In verse 6, in the King James Version, we read, quote, "And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven." End quote. There is only one minor correction in this verse, found at the end of the verse, where the translation reads, "that dwell in heaven." The Greek text actually says "in the heavenly tabernacle." Translators assumed that meant heaven, so they just stuck that in there, but the text actually reads "in the heavenly tabernacle," and as you are seeing from our study on astronomical dating, that doesn't necessarily mean the afterlife. So we will change that back to what it literally says in the Greek text, to "in the heavenly tabernacle." In verse 7, in the King James Version, we read, quote, "And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds, and tongues, and nations." End quote. We have three corrections in verse 7. First is the term, saints. The Greek word is hagios, and just means sacred or holy. So we will change that back to holy. The second correction is the word kindreds. It is the Greek word, phule, and literally means an offshoot. If you look up what offshoot means, it refers to the English word, descendants. So we will change that to the word descendants. The KJV word tongues is just an antiquated reference to language. The last correction in verse 7 comes with the word nations. It is the Greek word, ethne. It means tribes, and is also used euphemistically to refer to the Gentiles. Either term could be used here and work, but John is not using the term to refer to Gentiles in particular here. He is simply listing the totality of authority given to the beast by the dragon. So we will correct that term to a transliteration of the term ethne, to the English term, ethnicities. So our retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "And it was given to him to fight against the holy and conquer them, and he was given authority over all descendants and languages and ethnicities." End quote. In verse 8, in the KJV, we read, quote, "And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world." End quote. The first correction is the word, earth, once again, translated from the Greek word, gay, which just means land. The second correction is the word worship, which is once again, from the Greek word proskuneo, and means to crouch, to kiss like a dog licking his master's hand, to reverence, to pay homage to prostrate oneself in front of. All of the above. We will use the definition listed as reverence, because people are in denial about the word worship. And reverence is a better, more neutral term in modern English. It incorporates all of the above, and it is listed as the actual meaning of the term. The word slain is the same word again, sphadzo, and means butchered. And it is the same word used of the beast. Same exact word, sphadzo. But here John is contrasting something between the real Christ and the beast. He refers to the fact he was butchered before. The Greek word apo means to be separated from. Geographically it means away from, and used in reference to time, it can mean either before or after. Here it means before. The word translated as foundation is the Greek word katapole, and means founding. The last term world does not mean the modern word world. It is the Greek word cosmos. In Strong's Greek lexicon it means ordered arrangement. Thayer's Greek lexicon is a little more specific, stating it means constitution, order or government. Both lease the term order. So we will correct that term to the word order, and our corrected retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "And they reverenced him, all those residing in the land, whose name was not written in the book of life, of the Lamb, butchered before the founding of this order." End quote. In verse 9, in the KJV, we read, quote, "If any man have an ear, let him hear." End quote. That is precisely what is found in the Greek. In verse 10, in the KJV, we read, quote, "He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity, he that killeth with a sword must be killed with a sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." End quote. There are two corrections from the Greek in this text. The first correction is a very interesting correction. The KJV translates the Greek word, sunago, into the phrase, "he that leadeth." That is a rather amazing translation given that the term sunago is used 62 times in the New Testament. And out of those 62 times it is used, it is never translated this way, not even a single time. Which is really very odd. It appears there was something in the text the KJV translators were trying to bury. When you look up the word sunago, it is most often translated as assembled, assembly, gathered, gathering, together, etc. So that appears to be what the KJV translators were trying to hide. The Greek word sunago is just a variant of synagoge, which we get the word synagogue in English from, and is also translated into the word assembly, as in church. So apparently, the KJV translators didn't want anyone to know, not only does the beast preach sermons, he also has an assembly. We will change that word back to what it means in Greek, to the word assemble. The second part of that phrase, shall go, as in, shall go into captivity, is from the Greek word, hupago. Hupago means literally, to lead under. And we will correct the word saints, back into the word, holy. As noted previously. And our corrected retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "If any captivity assemble, into captivity they will lead themselves. If any with the sword kill, with the sword he need be killed. In this is the endurance and the faith of the holy." End quote. That completes our translation of the first prophecy. And our corrected translation reads as follows. Quote, "And I stood upon the beach of the sea, and I saw out of the sea a beast ascend having 7 heads and 10 horns. Upon his horns, 10 diadems and the name blasphemy. And the beast I saw was similar to a leopard, his feet is that of a bear and his mouth is the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave to him his power and his throne and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as butchered to death, and the stroke of his death was adored and admired in all the land behind the beast. And they groveled to the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they groveled to the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to fight against him? And given to him was a mouth, preaching big and blasphemous. And authority was given to him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth to blaspheme God, his name and his tabernacle, and those in the heavenly tabernacle. And it was given to him to fight against the holy and conquer them, and he was given authority over all descendants and languages and ethnicities. And they reverenced him, all those residing in the land whose name was not written in the book of life, of the Lamb, butchered before the founding of this order. If any man have an ear, let him hear." If any captivity assemble, into captivity they will lead themselves. If any with the sword kill, with the sword he need be killed. In this is the endurance and the faith of the holy." End quote. You can see several important differences from the KJV text, and what is actually there in the Textus Receptus. From the Textus Receptus, you see that the beast actually both preaches, and has an assembly. And John's language is one of his heads being slaughtered to death like Christ, and this death being adored and admired as an object of worship, sounds extremely familiar. Doesn't it? Much more familiar than what you will read in virtually all English, Church Board, translations. And there is obviously a reason for that. The translators do not want the text to look familiar on purpose, that is why it doesn't. But that also shows you what they have been intentionally hiding from the Greek text. Now we will translate the second prophecy between verses 11 through 18. Now we are going to translate directly from the Textus Receptus, the section of chapter 13, that constitutes the second prophecy, which begins in verse 11, and goes through to the end of the chapter in verse 18. Beginning in verse 11, we read, quote, "And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. And he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon." End quote. We have 2 corrections to make in verse 11. The first correction, as noted earlier, is from the Greek word lealeo, meaning more specifically, to preach, and the second correction is the Greek word ge, which means land, not earth. After our corrections, verse 11 in our retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "And I saw another beast arise out of the land, having 2 horns like a lamb, but preaching as a dragon." End quote. In verse 12, in the KJV, we read, quote, "And he exercises all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed." End quote. The first correction is with the word power, which is from the Greek word exousia, and means authority. And that has a particular specificity to legal authority. The second correction is the word earth, which once again is from the Greek word ge, and means the land. The third correction is the word worship, which we have already examined, and will replace with the word reverence. And the fourth correction is the term healed, which we also already examined, and is the concept of adoration and more properly translated as adore. Our corrected retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "And the authority of the former beast he does, all in the face of him, and makes the residents of the land, to reverence the former beast whose stroke of death was adored." End quote. In verse 13, we read, quote, "And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men." End quote. This is a short verse, and there is only one standard correction to make here, and that is with the word earth, which as you already know is from the Greek word ge, and simply means land. So we will correct that and retranslate this sentence as follows. Quote, "And he does great miracles and makes fire come down from heaven in the land, in the sight of men." In verse 14, we read, quote, "And deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live." End quote. The first correction is once again the word earth, which is used twice in this one verse, but should be the word land. The second correction is the English word image, from the Greek word icon, and means the English word icon. With those 2 corrections, our retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "And he deceives the residents of the land through the miracle that he gives to them in the face of the beast, preaching to the residents of the land, make an icon of the beast, that had the stroke of the sword and lived." End quote. Verse 15, in the KJV, reads as follows. Quote, "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and caused that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed." End quote. We have 3 corrections in this text that need to be made, 2 of which we have already examined. The first correction, however, is the English word life. It is being translated from the Greek word pneuma, which means spirit. The second correction is the word image, which should be the word icon. And the third correction is the word worship, translated from proskuneo, which we are replacing with a more inclusive term reverence, that is listed in the definition of that word. After those corrections, our retranslation of the text reads as follows. Quote, "And he gave of himself a powerful spirit to the icon of the beast, so that the icon of the beast even speaks, and he makes whoever does not reverence the icon of the beast, to be put to death." End quote. In verse 16, we read, quote, "And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand, or in their foreheads." End quote. Verse 16 is an accurate reflection of the Greek text. No corrections are needed. Verse 17 states, quote, "And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name." End quote. There is a very small, but important detail, that needs to be corrected in verse 17. If you look at the KJV text, you will see the phrase, buy and sell. That is actually an indirect interpretation of what exists in the Greek text. The word translated into the English word, buy, is the Greek word, agor adzo, and means the word, market. If you will notice in the lexicon, there is a parenthesis, with a notation by way of implication, and then the word is listed, purchase. But we are not supposed to be reading implications in translations, we are supposed to be reading what the word means. And the word means, market. When we look at the word that is translated as the English word sell, once again, we are reading someone's interpretation. That is the Greek word, poleo, and means, to trade, as in barter. The lexicon lists farther down the term sell, but that is once again a tertiary definition. The primary meaning of the term, poleo, is to trade or barter. So we find once again, a different set of words, in the Greek text, than we see translated into English. Why is that important? Because market and trade are two entirely different set of activities, than buy and sell. The text is stating that the point of economic disruption occurs in market and trading, which is on the back end of the economic process, not the front end, where there is consumer purchasing. There is no reference to buying and selling in the Greek text. Those are interpreted meanings, not literal translations. We are going to stick with what is actually written in the text, as market and trade. So the corrected translation would read as follows. Quote, "And no one is allowed to market or trade, if they do not have the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name." End quote. And the last verse in the chapter, verse 18, reads as follows in the KJV, quote, "Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. And his number is 666. End quote. And here we get to one of the most exciting jewels of wisdom, from the Textus Receptus Greek text, that has once again been buried in virtually all church board translations. We have looked at 17 verses, and you have seen how there are major discrepancies between the underlying Greek text and our English translations, with specific attention given to the KJV, because many think of this as the most reliable text in English. But you have seen that there is still a layer of theological bias and distortion draped over these texts, left there from the theology of the Church of England. But when we get to verse 18, we are going to see something so amazing and incredible, it will end all the tricks the counter-reformation pulls to get a substitute Antichrist. It will end every last one of them, forever, in a single blow. And that is precisely why it is never translated into English. Whenever the counter-reformation wants to produce a substitute Antichrist, they always quote Revelation chapter 13 verse 18, which they will always quote stating that it says to calculate the number of the beast. Then they will go to numerology and call it Gematria, and pretend that is what John was making reference to. And it is the biggest con job in the world right now. And that is precisely all that it is, because John said no such thing. In fact, he said quite the opposite. Even in the bad English translation, you can see that the translation uses the word count, not calculate. And if you know English and math, there is a huge difference between count and calculate. And we are going to look at this in much more detail, but here, we are simply trying to get a clean translation, to really find out what all this means. And in verse 18, in the Greek, John makes it perfectly clear, that if you are sitting around calculating someone's name with Gematria, you have not a clue, what he was talking about. Why? Because he actually comes right out and says it, in the Greek text. There is only one major correction that needs to be done in verse 18, but it is a doozy. It is probably the biggest correction in the whole chapter that needs to be made from the Greek. It is over the word, count. The word count is not in the Greek text. The word count is an interpretation of the Greek word, but the Greek word is not even the word count. It is the Greek word, sephizo. This is an unusual Greek word in the New Testament. It only occurs here and in Luke 14:28. It means literally to use pebbles. That is the definition of the Greek word. To translate it into English, you would translate it as use pebbles. Not as count. And definitely not in any ways calculate. It is actually a direct repudiation of the claim, the name of the Antichrist is to be derived from Gematria. In fact, John says if you are doing that, you don't have any understanding. He says to use pebbles. And while you don't use pebbles in Gematria, there is something very obvious that you do use pebbles in, and that is precisely what they are hiding from the public in chapter 13. When we exegete this chapter, verse by verse, you are going to find out exactly why he said use pebbles, and what that actually means. And you will never be fooled by lying counter-reformation preachers, again, because you will know precisely what they are trying to hide in their explanations. And according to the very text, straight from the Greek language in the Textus Receptus, you will have a mind that has understanding. According to John himself. Our corrected retranslation reads as follows. Quote, "In this is wisdom. The one that has understanding will use pebbles to enumerate the number of the beast. It is the number of a man. And his number is 666. End quote. We have now completed the final verse of the second prophecy, and chapter 13 as a whole. Our retranslation of the second prophecy, directly from the Textus Receptus, reads as follows, quote, "And I saw another beast, arise out of the land, having 2 horns like a lamb, but preaching as a dragon. And the authority of the former beast he does, all in the face of him, and makes the residents of the land, to worship the former beast whose stroke of death was adored. And he does great miracles and makes fire come down from heaven in the land, in the sight of men. And he deceives the residents of the land through the miracle that he gives to them in the face of the beast, preaching to the residents of the land, make an icon of the beast, that had the stroke of the sword and lived. And he gave of himself a powerful spirit to the icon of the beast, so that the icon of the beast even speaks, and he makes whoever does not reverence the icon of the beast, to be put to death. And he makes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free and the slave, to receive his mark upon their right forehand or upon their forehead. And no one is allowed to market or trade, if they do not have the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. In this is wisdom. The one that has understanding will use pebbles to enumerate the number of the beast. It is the number of a man. And his number is 666. End quote. That completes our translation of the Textus Receptus for Revelation chapter 13. Next, we will begin going through the verses to fully explore what all this new information really means. Get ready for some shocking surprises. Because it's not at all what you have been told. And the ones in public, on TV, and on the internet who have been talking to you the loudest and most frequent have been the very ones attempting to hide what is in this chapter. Find out why. Next. You saw in the translation of the Textus Receptus into English, that there are many translation decisions that are made over the selection of words. And many of the word choices in the King James translation are not the primary definitions of the Greek terms. Some of these word choices dramatically change the meaning of the text. As in the case of the selection of the word, healed, instead of the word, adored, as you saw in verse 3. And you saw that in translating the text from the Greek into English, we discovered many things not seen in the translations. For example, we learned that the head of the beast is not wounded but butchered, and that it is the same word used of Christ's crucifixion. We learned that the beast John is describing has a throne, a platform for preaching, and a religious icon of a bloody death that has a spirit connected to it. We also learned that the way to know the name of the beast is not by using Gematria, but by using pebbles to enumerate. In the next video, we will exegete the verses we have just translated from Revelation chapter 13, and you will learn even more amazingly specific things about what John was prophesying. And you will see how incredibly specific his prophecies actually were in reality. They are much more amazing and specific than anything counter-reformationists are telling the public. And you will also see that once these details are fully known, there is absolutely no mystery as to who or what John was prophesying about in history. The only mystery that really remains is whether or not we are going to heed his warnings about what he prophesied. And that could be a question that holds eternal implications for us all. Thank you for watching.